I want to talk to you about that opinion piece you've written, which I think is a really powerful piece where you've said some things that are quite controversial but are worth exploring. This I Stand With Dan, that's Dan Andrews, the Victorian Premier movement, and I'm going to call it that because it's like that. If you criticise Dan Andrews, particularly online, you get often relentlessly trolled with this I Stand With Dan kind of handle. You've compared those supporters to Trump supporters, not in their politics or their particular ideology, but the way they behave. Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, it's just the hyper-partisanship we've seen in the United States, Patricia, where, I mean, it's always existed in Australia at either end of the political spectrum. You've always had people in this country who believe the party or the leader for whom they vote can do no wrong. But it's just so pronounced now. It's so much larger than it used to be. And I've been watching the I Stand With Dan movement. I've been the victim of a few of their tirades over recent months. What strikes me is there's no acceptance that Daniel Andrews can make a mistake, and there's no acceptance that he should be scrutinised for doing it. Instead, he should be left alone. He should be allowed to do these press conferences without being, pestered over whose fault it was that the quarantine failed or who's responsible for not having contact tracing. And look, it's nothing amazing. I mean, he's a government. His government has made mistakes. There have been consequences. It happens. It's happened in the past. It'll happen in the future. But there's this sort of, I use the term cult-like mentality that the politician is more important than the people who've been affected by the decision or the journalists who just rocking up and trying to find out what happened and who's to blame. And it's the same that happens in the US. Trump can do no wrong, and if you question him, you get vilified. It's fake news, or it's someone else's fault, or it's a conspiracy. And we've seen some pretty awful campaigns against, journalists in Melbourne, Rachel Baxendale from The Australian. And what surprises me, these are people who sort of, classify themselves as progressives, as critical thinkers. Yet they behave in this manner, and I just think they're completely oblivious to their own sort of blind loyalty. I mean, a lot of them use that water drop little thing on Twitter, which is their own silent protest against what they believe was an inadequate scrutiny of Angus Taylor over his water holdings, that business he had with a water contract, yet they don't believe Andrews should be scrutinised. You look at these tweets. It's hilarious, some of them. How dare you ask him these questions? He's got a state to run. There was one I quoted in the article where an email surfaced a few weeks back which showed again that he's being less than forthright in his denials about being offered assistance from Canberra in terms of the army. And this person said, didn't you see his denial? Why don't you stick to the facts? And, it's at this stage where a politician's denial holds more weight than documentary evidence. I don't care about Dan Andrews or not Dan Andrews. I mean, you can vote for him, you can't vote for him. I thought he was a very good premier until, these stumbles. He may yet win the next election should he choose to stand. That's not my point. My point is there's this growing view that politicians are off limits. And this is a severe failure what's happened in Victoria with terrible consequences for people, and this ganging up on people who just want to, just ask legitimate questions and apply legitimate scrutiny, I find quite extraordinary. And look, it's the biggest example. It's not just him. Scott Morrison has supporters like this, but nothing like we've seen on this scale. Yeah,
look, I just want to put one thing to you. These people, I know they've approached me to say that they're standing against a campaign against Daniel Andrews. They say it's a campaign. I'll tell you what it is, what they think. They think it's a News Corporation campaign to dismantle or to disrupt the government to bring down the Premier. That's what they think. And
that's loopy, yeah.
Well, what do you say to that criticism, though, that there is a campaign?
I don't work for News Limited.
No, you don't.
I work for the Australian
You have, and so have I, just for full disclosure before people start tweeting it.
Yeah, about a zillion years ago. Yeah, I mean, I've been with Fairfax Channel 9 for well over a decade. I mean, it's not that. Look, News Limited has always had its agendas, right? And I'm not denying that. And they've always been agendas against progressive or Labor leaders. And I think a bit of this, in defence of these people, is that there is a lot of pent-up anger out there about the way, elements of the Australian media has behaved in recent years, especially some of the News Corp tabloids when it comes to election time. And so it's not surprising some of them think that way, but I'm not thinking that way. And and a lot of other, and even a lot of the News Corp journos covering this story aren't thinking that way. Dan, this is just it's just a run of the mill stuff up by a government with terrible consequences, and. I'm just calling it out. I just think these, it's okay to accept that the person you support in politics can make mistakes. It's not a problem. And the danger is when we stop accepting that, then politics will collapse because there are no longer agreed norms as to what's wrong and what's right. And if the other side starts behaving like that, we'll quickly become the United States. I'm not taking sides here. I just think it's a disturbing trend. And I can tell you from the sheer volume of messages I've had today, emails and text messages, there's a lot of people on all sides of the spectrum who think the same way. But they don't want to express support on social media because they'll get the same sort of rubbish that everyone else gets.
That's right, Phil. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good on you, Pat.